sister Amalia, his oldest sister, and also to provide his education all the way through the University of Vienna. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough money to provide a dowry for his sister Antonia, so they took care of that in some other ways. What did Baraga learn from his mother? When you read everything he writes about his mother, the one thing that was critical was she led the children in morning and evening prayers every day. She was religious about this. How often do we tell parents, what's the best thing you can do with your children? Pray with them. She led them in daily rosary. She imbued with him a tremendous devotion to Our Lady. She also, since they were landed gentry, one of the things you were responsible for was visiting, the peasants that worked on your lands. And one of the things she did is she took her children. She didn't go by herself to visit these people, especially if they were sick. She took her children with them in order to teach them that they had a responsibility, a ministry of service, which was part of their faith. And finally, I always laugh because I think of all the writing I've read of what Father Pierce is writing back to Baraga's sister Amalia back in Europe about his impression. What drove Father Pierce crazy about Baraga was that he never seemed to take it easy. He never relaxed. And I always think this came from his mother because his mother told him never to waste any moment. Baraga's father was from the northern part of Slovenia. He was not landed gentry. He was a person that made his living managing large estates. And so in many ways, when he married this woman from the Jędrzej family, he moved up in the world. He moved into landed gentry. He was married once before, he's widowed. He had a son, Franz. In fact, what was good about Franz is later on, both of Baraga's parents died when he was young. And Franz stepped in to take over the estate. And as far as we can tell, he managed it very effectively to make sure that not only was everything kept there for the children, but there was more than enough to continue. In fact, later on, his father took the estate that they had in Malavas, which was it was a manor house, and he traded it up for something that looks like a real castle. It had a lot of debt. Franz worked to reduce that debt so that by the time Amalia, Frederick, and Antonia were adults, most of that debt was taken away. His father also had a brother, Ignaz, and his brother then took care of, while Franz took care of the estate, his brother took care of all the other assets to make sure, and as far as we can tell, he treated him very well. What did he learn from his father? This seriousness, this earnestness that typified everything that Baraga did, I think came from his father. His father was extremely organized, and something that he emphasized with his son also. He was industrious, he definitely was decisive. If there's anything you can tell about Baraga, no matter what dangerous situation he faced, he always knew how to make a decision to continue. He never stopped, he never gave up. And finally, the last thing he learned from his father was hunting. I don't think this 8-year-old boy ever dreamed that he'd use all the skills he learned from his father in the woods later on in his life, in his own ministry. When Baraga was about 9 years old, his father sent him to Ljubljana. At that point, there weren't really grade schools the way we think of now. And he sent him to his old friend, Dr. Dolinar, who was the canon lawyer teaching at the School of Theology. Dr. Dolinar also ran a boarding school for boys, mostly kids that came from landed gentry. All three of the children landed up eventually there, and Baraga eventually became engaged to his daughter Anna. What was important about Dolinar? You have to sit there and take a look at the history of the Austrian Empire during these tumultuous times. So you got to remember, you've got the French Revolution going on right before this. Napoleon comes into power. What does that mean? Napoleon marches across Eastern Europe 3 times. Baraga, before he went to high school, was under French rule 3 times, and also reverting back to Austrian rule. Completely chaotic. In fact, one of the things that Dr. Dolinar helped him to learn is how to deal with chaotic times. How useful was this later on in life? Think about the chaotic times that Baraga himself had to deal with. First of all, in the 1840s into the 1850s, it was the issues concerning resettlement of Indians to the other side of the Mississippi. Huge thing. And he and Pierce did step in to do what they could by purchasing property and eventually deeding it over to Indian tribes. The second thing, you take a look at how this area changed so dramatically with the growing of the timber industry, the copper mines and the iron ore mines starting to expand in the Upper Peninsula. Baraga started out when there were virtually no people in UP, and then suddenly you take a look at what happened by the middle 1850s. It's full of people with all kinds of towns growing up all over the place. And finally, the third chaotic thing you have to deal with was the Civil War, in terms of what this changed, in terms of the dynamics of what happened with all of this production. How to deal with politically chaotic times is something he learned right at the knee of Dr. Dolinar. Dr. Dolinar was also the one that taught him languages. So he shows up, he's 9 years old. As landed gentry, he didn't have to know any other language except Slovenian. It was kind of interesting. So Dr. Dolinar taught him French, he taught him German very, very well. Not only that, but he taught him linguistics. Now you take a look at what he did here in this area. As soon as he got here, the first year he was here, he started writing a dictionary of Ottawa words and wrote a prayer book almost immediately. The ability to be able to take a language, parse it, analyze it, structure it, and put it together is something that he learned way back with Dr. Dolinar. And finally, the thing I think is most important is that Dr. Dolinar also taught him the importance of being able to communicate with people in their own language. So this emphasis on learning multiple languages is being able to connect with people in the language that's closest to them. The fourth person, you'll never read this. Most of this is just here to remind me to make sure I get through some of this. Probably the most critical person in his spiritual life was St. Clement Hofbauer. St. Clement was an interesting person. He tried to enter the seminary in Vienna and was totally turned off by the Jansenism that he ran into in the seminary. He left there with a friend of his, went to Rome to join the Redemptorists. And what's critical is St. Alphonse Liguori was still alive. So St. Clement was exposed to one of the great saints of that area during that period of time. When he was ordained, he went to Poland. He ran into the same Napoleonic forces that had overrun Slovenia 3 times, and Napoleon was not a great friend of the Catholic Church, and he practically got thrown out of Poland, so he went back to Vienna where he'd been before during his early university times. He gets to Vienna, and what does he find? Rampant Jansenism. What does this mean? I'm not going to give you a technical definition, but I'm going to tell you what it looked like. There was no preaching at Masses on Sunday. No preaching at Masses on Sunday, let alone during the day of the week. People were discouraged from going to confession. People were discouraged from going to communion, maybe twice a year at most. And so what happened is he was very fortunate. He couldn't function very well as a diocesan priest under this environment, but he got assigned to be the chaplain for a group of Ursuline nuns. And nobody really cared what he did there. So what did he do? He preached. He confessed. He encouraged people to go to communion. He explained to people that God's love is unbounded. And what happened was this chapel where this monastery where these Ursuline nuns were, was very close to the University of Vienna, and he started to attract students. And among them was Frederick Baraga. Among them was von Rauscher, the future Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna. Among them was also Father Hatcher, who landed up here. So you get all these people coming together, they just clung to this man. And what it was is he focused on preparing them by using the Bible, other church documents, but he preached to them about the importance of confession in their lives. So we'll go a little bit more into Jansenism, because this is what he was teaching the opposite of. Jansenism did not teach the mercy of God. Salvation was limited. I had a parishioner a couple years ago who told me only 19,000 something people are going to make it to heaven. I told him, Mike, I give up. I can easily find 19,000 people who have been holier than me since the time of Christ. So why should I do any of this? It kind of astounded him. But that's basically what they're doing. So confession was run by priests who were viewed as being these judges, and you had to be careful not to absolve people whom God wouldn't absolve, all right? You have to be careful not to absolve people that God would not absolve. Can you imagine how depressing it is? Why would you even try? And so how do you prove that you're truly contrite? The second thing that happened was that they also didn't preach freedom of will. It's like they forgot the whole first part of Genesis, where we're created in the image and likeness of God. Image and likeness of God means that we're given free will, we're the ability to create, and the ability to, as we see in the motto, to love and serve. That wasn't part of Jansenism at all. Few people are going to be called to heaven. So what happened is confessions dried up, communions dried up. Of course, there's really, what reason do you even have for going to Mass? Added on to this is something else that's happening in the Austrian Empire, and these are the Josephine reforms. Now, you could spend an hour just talking about these, but part of the problem was in some parts of Eastern Europe, the monasteries owned huge amounts of property. I take a look at where my family's from, both my mother and my father. I go back to the late 1700s, and they were vassal peasants to an abbot in Stichna. And so Emperor Joseph II tried to break all this stuff up, and some of it needed to be done in order to expand the freedom of people. So I'm not going to negate that. However, he went beyond that. So he started putting priests on the payroll of the state. He eliminated a lot of religious orders, except for the ones that had to do with teaching or they worked in hospitals. But then he went farther and looked at the liturgy. So let's start taking a look at the vestments the priests wore. Don't like all the jewels on the vestments. So stuff that we call the smells and the bells of liturgy got abolished, right? They even got to the point where they determined the number of candles that would be permitted to be lit on an altar. That's how far this went. Banished church organizations. But it went farther than that. There is a classification of something called folk liturgies. What's folk liturgy? I mean, this is astounding to me, think, because we're in the middle of Eucharistic revival, renovation, right? Eucharistic adoration and benediction are folk liturgies, almost banned. Saying the rosary is a folk liturgy. Going to Stations of the Cross are folk liturgies. Going on pilgrimages are folk liturgies. All of these things are being discouraged. So you can understand when I took a look at Dushna Pasha, Pastor of the Soul, and I take a look at what's in this book. Benediction and adoration, right? We've got rosaries, we've got 2 Stations of the Cross, we've got prayers, we've got rituals. Suddenly it struck me as we were translating this, this was like diametrically opposite of what the emperor was pushing, as well as some of the ecclesiastical authorities. So what happens to Baraga? He ends up leaving St. Clement in Vienna, comes back to enter the diocesan seminary. How he survived the 2 years in the seminary, because the problem with it is that Jansenism had gotten introduced into Slovenia already in the 1770s, and it stayed all the way into the 1840s. So 10 years after he left, it was still present. It was still present. So Baraga's first assignment is up north, close to where my mother's from. And what does he do? He preaches. What does he preach? The everlasting love of God and his boundless mercy. What does he do? He encourages people to go to confession. And then he shows up, he's in a confessional all the time, and then he's encouraging people to go to communion. He becomes so popular that parishes, people from the parishes all around showed up to listen to him preach. They lined up in church to go to confession to him. This got to be a problem. And the problem was solved by taking him and moving him to the opposite end of the country. So you got to think, this is like taking somebody from Michigan and moving him to the most rural part of Alaska or Alabama. I mean, he was so far south in Slovenia, he could have spit into the Kolpa River, which is the boundary between Slovenia and Croatia. He was sent to the middle of nowhere. And he didn't get the message. He gets down to Chernomil where he was, and what does he do? He preaches. He tells people that God's love is boundless. There's nothing they can do that he can't forgive. He encourages them to go to confession. He encourages them to go to communion. They don't have Stations of the Cross. So he goes out and he buys them. Those Stations of the Cross are still in that church. There's a replica of them up at the Baraga Educational Center in Marquette. And you have to understand what happened to him in terms of his assignment. So there are two other assistants assigned in this place, and they're ranked by your seniority. He has the most seniority, and the pastor assigned him as assistant number 3. In fact, there's an ugly story that one time assistant number 2 was out walking through the fields, and his boots were all muddy. He comes back and he orders Baraga to pull his boots off and clean them. And Baraga got down on his knees and did just that. That priest, 20 years later, when Baraga was back on one of his visits, begged him for forgiveness. Begged him for forgiveness. In the middle of all this, he writes Pasture of the Soul. Oh my God, when we're translating this, we're trying to figure out what went wrong here. Because he submitted it and it didn't get printed. He could not get any kind of imprimatur on it. And when we read the record, it said the words were too high class for peasants. And we looked at it and I'm like, are you kidding me? We had trouble with some of the words. They were written in such local, mid-19th century Slovenian that we couldn't find them in regular dictionaries. We had to go back to linguists who were experts in folk language from that period of time in order to get a proper translation of these words. So what's happening here? This is a delaying action. This is a delaying action. I mean, if you're in a situation where you're discouraging folk liturgies like benediction and adoration and rosary and Stations of the Cross, this is about the last book in the world you want published. And what's absolutely miraculous is that as Baraga gets ready to leave to go to America in late 1830, boom, permission goes through and it's printed. We don't even think that he had enough time to get a copy of it before he left. And I am sure that they thought at the time, oh, we got rid of a problem, right? We got rid of a problem. To their amazement, that first edition, which was a couple thousand printing, went out of print almost immediately. They printed a second edition almost immediately. That book was so popular that there's no other Slovenian prayer book written in that period, since 1830, that has printed as many copies. My mother, growing up in northern Slovenia in the 1930s, said that their book, the one that they used for family prayer, was the 1905 edition, which was the 11th printing. That's how important that book was in terms of being able to take people back to the core part of their faith. So, what is Dushna Pasha? Folk liturgies. Jesus Christ values our soul. He suffered so much. Yes, sin pains him, but there is nothing that'll stop you from, as long as you're willing to ask for forgiveness, it will be extended. So the burden is on us. That's what Baraga preached. The burden is on us, not on Christ. And in spite of our sinfulness, in spite of our thanklessness, we will be forgiven. Pray for everybody. Go to confession. Go to communion. Adore the Eucharist. Make it a part of your life. Communion is your chance to become part of God. All right? So, Baraga leaves. He comes, spends a little bit of time in Cincinnati, and his first assignment is up here. All right? What happens when he's up here? He goes directly to Arp Krosh. He runs into Dejin, who is, because of sickness and fatigue, decided he's going to meet him, and they absolutely overlap only by a little bit of time. But he knew this area. He'd read the Jesuit Relations. He knew that St. Isaac Jogues had been up in the Sioux. He knew everything there was about Père Marquette, who's one of my heroes. The area where I live in Illinois was also Christianized by Père Marquette. I work in a town called Lamont. Down the street from me was, in the early 1700s, a trading post that was staffed by French traders that came out of the Mac and also out of the Sioux. And Marquette made it all the way down and established the very first parish in the state of Illinois in 1673, Parish of Immaculate Conception, which still exists. Baraga knew all this. He knew about Father Desjardins, who was basically a pastor here immediately after the French and Indian War for about 25 years. He knew all of this. He knew he had met Father Gabriel Richard. So Richard had spent time in Kaskaskia, Illinois, about 6 years, somewhere in the 1790s, came up to Detroit, went back and forth between Arb Croche and Detroit, was a very critical person helping him to understand what this area was like. And what happened was that Baraga fell in love with this area. Maybe the first time he'd fallen in love in his whole life. Because finally he found a place where he had the freedom to preach about the everlasting mercy of God in a way that he'd been hampered in the past. He took this group of Indians, he found them to be well evangelized. When he writes about this area, he's very impressed with what he's been left with. And he followed these people around. Where did he follow them to? He followed them around the bay to Grand Traverse Bay. The Indians like to hunt and fish different times of the year. He went with there, and what did he find? He found some opposition there because that was on the boundaries of all the missions. The people weren't as evangelized. He went out to the islands here in Michigan. And what did he find there? Same thing. It was kind of the communities were split. So he realized there would be more work here. Baraga, at times the Indians would go up to the Sioux. And the reason they went up to the Sioux is we always forget about this. We think the United States has been together forever. We forget about the War of 1812 and how much the British, especially the Canadian British, wanted to split this country up. That did not stop in 1814. The Canadians continued to hope, and they saw the tensions that were occurring out of slave issues here in the United States, and they thought there was a chance to break up the Union one more time and try to grab at least some of the northern states, maybe some of even the New England states, maybe grab the UP back. And so what did they do? They sent out commissioners to Drummond Island every year, and unfortunately for us, the amount of goods and things that the Indians got from this area from the Canadians more than they got from the American government. And Baraga followed them up and tried to keep them in the fold. These are all things he did. In 1832, he took the documents that he created for this dictionary and also this prayer book. He went down to Detroit. And in Detroit, he was hoping to print a book, the very first print. He was successful in that, but he walked into a cholera epidemic. And that cholera epidemic took Father Gabriel Richard. Baraga was at his deathbed. He stayed with him to the end. He also continued to minister all those people. To me, it's half a miracle if you take a look at the number of priests as well as healthcare workers that died in that cholera epidemic. It's incredible. During that same period of time, Bishop Fenwick, who was the first archbishop of this area, who was in Cincinnati, had gone up to northern Ohio, and in that same cholera epidemic died in Worcester, Ohio. So this was, I find it as one of the very first miracles in Baraga's life that he didn't fall to that cholera epidemic. At that point in time, when Fenwick died, Reese became the bishop, and Baraga petitioned him to be able to move over across into the UP almost anywhere. One of the things that he'd done when he was at Arb Croche was that he did cross over to Manistee. In fact, there's a replica of the church in Manistee there in the middle of one of the parks, and along with a burial ground. And he found the people extremely welcoming, and they begged him to stay, but he returned. And so he asked permission to move, and instead what Bishop Reese did is he decided he was going to make him the missionary to all the Ottawa from Grand Rapids north. In fact, moved him from Arb Croche to Grand Rapids. And before Bishop Walsh alluded to what happened in Grand Rapids, if you take a look at the territorial boundaries of the United States in the early 1830s, they stopped at Grand Rapids. Everything north of that was Indian territory. So he put him right on the border. In fact, there was an argument at one point whether the missions that he created were legal or not, because it all depended on what side of the border he put them on. And he ran into trouble. He ran into trouble with the fur traders, the whiskey traders, some of the Protestant ministers, and as Bishop Walsh discussed at one point, he had Indians howling around his hut all night, threatening to kill him, and he survived that. The end result of that was the petitions went all the way up to the governor of Michigan to move him. And so Reese finally decided Baraga didn't want to be there. The governor didn't want him. Really, nobody wanted them except for the Indians. And so what he did is he granted him permission to move north, and he was transferred eventually to La Pointe, Wisconsin. And so that's a whole nother history in terms of Baraga's taking a look at where he should be. He'd been in the Sioux, he was in La Pointe, and eventually he decided the best place to be was smack dab in the middle, and that's why he moved to Lons eventually. What's Baraga's spirituality? You know what I'm going to say. It's realizing we're helpless. It's realizing that God is our only hope. It's realizing that we have to confess. And by confession, we have a chance to rebuild the relationship with God and everybody else around us that we've destroyed. This is the core part of what he preached. He preached, and this is what I discovered as we translated Pasture of the Soul, that message got preached in his first assignment in Slovenia. He preached that message in the second assignment he had in Slovenia. He preached that message here in Arb Croche. He preached it in Manistee. He preached it in La Pointe. He preached it all the way out to Fond du Lac on the other side of Duluth. He preached that message in Thunder Bay. He preached it in Goulet Bay. No matter where he went, he preached that same message. And so that's probably one of the most important things about this is that we need, if we're going to take anything away from Baraga, is to accept this. We need to accept how helpless we are. Our only hope is in God. And that confession, communion, repentance, and transformation is the way that we gain everlasting life. And it's true, I think Baraga would have been a knight. Okay, I'm going to skip over this quickly. I've gone through this. What does Arb Croche mean for Baraga? I have thought about this long and hard. I really believe he learned how to be a missionary here. This was so fundamental for the rest of his life in terms of what his ministry was like. He found it to be a welcoming place. He always described not just the Indians, but also the white people in this area. This was a place he liked to live in. He learned the language here. As a linguist, he realized how important it was to be able to speak to people in the language that they speak. In Slovenian, we have a proverb, which translated to English, which says, the heart needs to pray to God. The heart needs to pray to God. You can't pray to God with your heart in a language that's foreign to you. He found this place to be well evangelized, and that became critical for the next point. He sent many of his missionaries, before he sent them anywhere else, he sent them here to be trained. And I think it's not so much that they would deal with people, he felt comfortable with the community here, training his missionaries to be able to move them to other places. And finally, the one thing I really believe, I think he saved his soul here. I often wonder what would have happened to him if he had continued in his ministry in Slovenia, whether that would eventually have destroyed his spiritual life, whether he withstood it. Here he found freedom to preach the essential message that he learned from St. Clement. All right, Father Franz Pirc. So he's one of my favorite people. He is so opposite Baraga. Baraga's born into landed gentry. Pirc is born into a peasant family that doesn't own anything. They're farmers. They're just not farmers, they're tenant farmers. And so because of that, from the time he was young, he learned about agronomy, agriculture, botany. These are all things that he lived with, and he thrived in it. He reveled in it. And interestingly enough, because he grew up in a peasant family, he couldn't get away with just knowing Slovenian. He had to learn Austrian German. He had to be able to speak to the people who owned the vassal states in the language they were comfortable with. And so he learned Austrian German from the time he was a kid. He enters the seminary in 1810. Do the calculation, figure out how old he was. Baraga enters the seminary when he's 20. He's almost 27. What does that tell you? At that period of time, in order to be able to go to seminary, you had to pay your own way. He had no dowry. He had no inherited assets. He had to figure out a way to earn his way to go to seminary. There's a level of commitment there which is much different. His first assignment was very close to where Baraga's first assignment was, and I sometimes wonder in the course of this whether they had actually encountered each other prior to coming to America. I'm not sure. His second parish is now in an area which was assigned to, it's in Udine, which is an area that was reassigned to Italy by the League of Nations after World War I. And his third parish, where he became a pastor, was in Piece and also Podbrezia. Podbrezia is an area where ancestrally on my mother's father's side of the family we're from. He continued his studies and his interests in botany, agriculture, agronomy, and etc., to the point that he put together a book called Krainski Vrtner, and what this means is the Carniolan horticulturist in 1830. Okay, a lot of people publish stuff in horticulture. No, not really. It turns out to be the very first thing that was ever published in the Slovenian language in this. Everything else was published in other languages. And so when he came to America, all these friends he had who had nothing to do with religion, they were horticulturists, agronomists. They continued to pester him. So he's got this wonderful, wonderful correspondence going back and forth on stuff he found here in the Arprosh area. To the point where putting together the book he wrote and all the correspondence analyzing the state of agriculture and botany here in the United States, he landed up, the Carniolan Agricultural Society gave him an award in 1842. Here's a picture of his birthplace. I put that on purposely because if you look in the background, you can see the top of warehouse. It's my cousin's warehouse. But there's actually a plaque on that wall. The plaque on the wall is, what it says is, in the town of Kamnik was born the father of Slovenian horticulture and the very first arborist and scientific writer of fruit orchards, Franz Pirc, 1785 to 1880, promoter of fruit orchards and the study of fruit orchards, and missionary in Michigan and Minnesota in the United States, put up by the Fruit Orchards Association of Slovenia in 1982. For me, you have to understand a little bit about Slovenian history. What's important is prior to 1991, it's very hard to find any plaques that say they're from Slovenians. We were still part of Yugoslavia at the time. We broke away in 1991. What's important here is that they asserted their identity as Slovenians in putting this plaque on the wall on the birthplace of where Pirc was born. The house that I showed before is not the original house. The house he was born in was probably a one-room hovel made out of stones, very opposite of the way that Baraga was born. In his last parish, I bring this up just to realize, Pirc is so revered in that section of the country and still by people in the Department of Agriculture and professionally. The last parish he served put up a monument a number of years ago, and this is a picture of this. And in fact, what I wanted to mention, recently they did a whole symposium on Pirc in Podbrezia, and I'm trying to get a copy. Somebody actually published a book. I want to get a hold of that and get that translated into English for your benefit. And this is the Pirc monument in Pirc, Minnesota. It shows an Indian and also a German settler being blessed by him. What's interesting is that he has two different Knights of Columbus councils named for him. The one here, of course, and as well as Pirc, Minnesota. Pirc comes to America. What happens? He lands up in Detroit. It's fall. You don't have the kind of ships running like you do nowadays. All we had were sailing ships that couldn't sail anymore in that weather. Lake Superior was too rough. He had been corresponding with Baraga when he was still in Grand Rapids. And what happened was, by this time, Baraga transfers to LaPointe, Wisconsin, the other end of Superior. There's no way to get there. And so what he does is he camps out in Sault Ste. Marie and also in L'Arproche. So he's here for a couple years. And he kind of swings around all the way also to Little Traverse Bay, covers this whole area. One of the most important parts that was one of the most moving things of his ministry in this area is that he met a family that was extremely religious. This Ottawa girl was 15 years old. She had 3 visions of God before she died, and he was with her to the end. This girl moved him so much that to the end of his life, anytime he ran into difficulties, he prayed to her to intercede to God for him. All right? This is something he writes about more than once. What's critical here is also, you get into these discussions, should you civilize the Indians before you Christianize them? And when you read what he writes back to his friends, he says, I don't understand what civilizing a nation means, but all I know is that they're some of the most devout people I've ever dealt with. In fact, this is embarrassing to me because he writes, I find them to be more devout Catholics than my last parish. Well, that's where all my family comes from. So I hope it's not my ancestors. Father Pearce ministered to the body and the soul. So Baraga couldn't care less about agriculture. Pearce, a number of times when they visit, he says, plant a garden. Get some greens in your diet. Quit eating potatoes all the time. You need some other types of protein. Pearce was the opposite. So one of the things he did, he was so interested in fruit orchards, he helped plant fruit orchards all through this area. This morning, Jane Cardinal took me on one of my favorite rides, which is up Michigan 119, the Tunnel of Trees. And there's still a couple places, and Jane was able to point them out to me, where it's the leftover of some of the terracing, the palisades, that he helped create for the Indians to create natural watering of gardens that occurred. So Pearce landed up ministering here for 12 years. And what he did is he was an agronomist. So he taught him a lot about fruit orchards. He taught a lot about different types of plants you can feed, you can grow. And of course, he was also, what people don't give him enough credit for, he was also a homeopath. What occurred in Slovenia, and he learned this from his days back in ministering in his parishes, physicians were few and far between. Priests were some of the most educated people in the area. It fell upon the priests oftentimes to heal not just the soul, but also the body. Pearce, because of his deep interest in botany, was interested in the curative powers of plants as well and become an expert in this. And he brought these skills with him when he ministered to the Indians. I had read about how he had done smallpox vaccination on the Indian populations in Minnesota. Jane corrected me last night as we talked. She said he was already doing that here. He had vaccinated at least 1,800 Indians at one shot. So this is one thing, the Indians realized that this was a man that could heal both the body and the soul. He was here 12 years. Why did he leave? This has always bothered me. I've always, as I read the stuff on Pearce, what caused him to leave? Because he really liked being here. And what I discovered is that he aggravated the Bishop of Detroit. A couple of years ago, when I was up at the offices at the Baraga Research Center, Lenora asked me to go into the archive to take a look at microfilm videotape that Joe Gregorich had made in the 1950s. And these tapes are in multiple languages, French, German, as well as Slovenian. She wanted me to isolate the Slovenian ones out. And, you set me in a bunch of old documents, and, it's hard to pull me out of there. And I started going through the microfilm, and I read French, and I realized that these weren't Baraga microwaves, the microfilm. These were Pearce reports. They were reports from the mission here in Arb Croche to the Bishop of Detroit in 1844, and then I picked up the one to 1845. What he writes in 1844 is, I am very pleased that the newspapers in Detroit are reporting on how we're working with the Indians in our school in the mechanical arts. That meant teaching them blacksmithing, carpentry, cabinetry, etc. However, I'm extremely concerned about the movement of Indians to the other side of the Mississippi. We've seen what happened to the Potawatomi, in northern Indiana, southern Michigan, Illinois. You need to do something about this. So then, in all curiosity, I flipped to the report of 1845. It's probably one of the most inflammatory things I've ever read between a pastor and his bishop. And what he writes, he said, last year in my report, I wrote to you about my concerns. You have done nothing. If you don't, we will. And of course, we know, what's the legacy of that? He and Baraga went out and did buy tracts of land in different areas and helped deed these properties over to the Indian tribes. Baraga at one point, and he's just about, at this point, he's vicar, he's not appointed bishop yet, but he realizes that this is untenable to keep him here. So he already had Lauderdale here. He also had Baraga, who would become the second bishop of Marquette. What he does is he arranges for a transfer of Pirtz to Minnesota. It must have broke his heart. This is a friend. It was probably the person he'd missioned the longest with here in the United States. And he lost him because at this point, Minnesota gets split off and becomes part of not his vicariate anymore. His vicariate stops in northern Wisconsin, which is right now about Superior. And this becomes now part of the Diocese of St. Paul. So Pirtz goes to St. Paul. What happens? The bishop there gives him everything north of the Twin Cities. Everything. Have you ever driven that? I have. At one point, I decided, my wife and I drove from the very farthest mission he had there, which is probably around Grand Portage, and we drove to the Crow Wing Reservation. So driving at about 60 miles an hour, it'll take you 5 hours. It'll take you 5 hours just to cover that distance. And his mission extended beyond the Crow Wing Reservation. So Pirtz goes there. It's interesting that the Ojibwe there give him a nickname. His name was Old Man Black Coat. Old Man Black Coat. And he made the Crow Wing Reservation his center of operations for the rest of the state of Minnesota. And what's interesting is he developed enough trust in the Indians when the Civil War breaks out. There's a story that some of the warriors had volunteered to join the Union Army, and they came for him for a blessing. Not a single Indian who had come to him for a blessing was killed in battle in the Civil War. That was in 1861. In 1862, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Minnesota history, but there was a Sioux uprising in western Minnesota. And what occurred was some of the very far western Ojibwe were starting to talk about joining with the Sioux in order to try to drive the whites out of that part of Minnesota. So Chief Holiday was the head of that particular group of Indians. He called for a war council, and he absolutely forbid anybody else to walk in on that council. Nobody, under pain of death. Pirtz at that time was about where St. John's College is in Collegeville, Minnesota. He hears about this. Instead of running the other way because it looked like there was going to be a major uprising, he goes straight for where this council is being held. He walks up to the perimeter, and a lot of the men there knew him, and they just said, "Father, we can't let you in. They'll kill you." And then one of the men says, "Well, Chief Holiday said that nobody's allowed to walk in. We're going to carry you in." So they grabbed his arms and his legs, and they walked. The amount of bravery. I mean, you're sitting there, you could be dead in the next 10 minutes. And he persisted to be able to go in there, and what he managed to do was to be able to convince him to not join the Sioux uprising at all. The number of lives he saved with that one act of bravery is I have no idea. So he was a peacemaker. He convinced Father Lawrence Lauderdale, who was also in your wall of pastors, to migrate. Lauderdale wanted to go to an area that was much more dominated by Indians, and so he felt that this area had too many whites. Lauderdale follows him to the Crow Wing reservations, and when he's only out there a couple years, he violated a key rule that Father Pirtz had told him. Father Pirtz told him, don't ever in wintertime go out without having an Indian guide. There was a call for somebody who was dying. There wasn't an Indian guide anywhere close by. And so Lauderdale goes out, makes his call, on the way back, freezes on the lake. They found his body a day later, frozen in a kneeling position. And so he is now buried in Calvary Cemetery. He's the very first priest buried in the Diocese of Duluth. He's in the priest circle at the very beginning of it. It broke Pirtz's heart. It broke Pirtz's heart because he found in him, he knew he was getting older, and he was looking for somebody to be able to replace who had the same passion he did for working with these people. One of the last things he did was he recruited another priest, Joseph Buch, to come to the United States. Joseph Buch would go on to be one of the most famous Indian missionaries in the state of Minnesota. He was also, between he and Father Pearce, they invited the Benedictines so Collegeville, St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota, was there because of the invitation of Pearce and Buch. St. Scholastica's Monastery, which is the women Benedictines, went to Duluth. They're there at the invitation of Pearce and Buch. I do a lot of work with the Benedictine Health Systems, which is headquartered between Duluth and the Twin Cities, and the women of St. Scholastica's Monastery took great delight that I knew who one of their founders was for that group of people. I'm at the end. I just have one more plug. One of the things that bothers me about Father Pearce, I've been on a kick to find the graves of all these missionaries who worked and created church across the upper Midwest. And Father Pearce's grave lies underneath a parking lot in Ljubljana. So what happened is the major cemetery in Ljubljana was moved in 1904, but he was in a section that was not moved. They left it. And the problem is during World War II, the Germans used the monuments from the graves to create a pillbox. So the actual location of the graves were lost. But the local people still knew where Father Pearce's grave was. In the communist era, the property was confiscated and it was paved over. So I've often said that if I ever win the lottery, I'm buying that piece of property. I'm pulling up all the asphalt. I'm going to have grass planted and a big monument placed to Father Pearce because he's one of the most important missionaries up in the upper Midwest. The second kick I have is I'm surprised as I go through the necrologies for all of these dioceses that were created, Gaylord and Marquette and Duluth and Superior and Green Bay and St. Cloud and Crookston. And I go through their necrologies and I look for the names of these priests that helped build church, and they're not in there. And so the second kick I have in life, and this one has more possibility of ever making, I want to make sure that we're able to document the lives of all these men that created church in this area to make sure that they're still prayed for. And so what I'd like to ask you to do is, when you have time, think about the blessing of the Catholic faith that we have here. Think about the men and the women who helped create church here, and keep them in your prayers. Thank you. Thank you.
So we knew Deacon Vidmar give us a great speech, so we were trying to come up with something that we could give him to remember us from. And out on your wall, when you leave tonight, Father Francis Pearce is the fourth pastor of Holy Childhood. So Jane Cardinal, our historian and artist, would you please stand? She spent 5 days making this very intricate icon, not a painting, an icon of Father Francis Pearce. And we'd like to have this for your office wall.
Thank you very much.
Maybe we could get a photo of it.
Yeah.
Is there somebody with a camera in there? Maybe
Mine is down there.
There he is. Okay, look towards it.
Need to pivot left. They want to see it too. Thank you very much. That is precious, especially since it's coming from Jane.
So if you would just stay for a second.
I will.
Okay, now I would like to just say a couple other announcements. I want to thank everybody here for coming, and also everybody in the kitchen. And I know I just saw our state representative, John DeMoose, sneak in from Lansing. He made it up in time, and he's been here for about an hour or so. Are there any questions? We have about, 5 or 6 really good people here that might be able to answer your questions. One of them being Dr. Vidmar here. Is there any questions? They're tired. They're,
How would you see us right now in this particular time and climate with Catholicism, our Native American brothers and sisters? I always see right now Baraga as kind of that bridge for us. How would you maybe express that kind of maybe a path?
Yeah, good question. Curtis, I like your response to this one too. I tell you, one of the things that always, yeah. So if you take a look at the state of Catholicism, the state of where Native Americans are with their own faith, where do we bridge this gap at times? And I think that's an excellent question. I take a look at people, especially like Baraga and Pearce, Ladajar, Chabul, and all these other men that were part of this group. The book that's there, they followed him to America. It's incredible. It's 2 things. The name is on, they followed Christ to America, but they also followed Baraga to America. And I think what's critical about many of these men, including some of the men that came out of other parts of the Austrian Empire, these are people who came from areas that were oppressed. They came from areas that were oppressed. I take a look at, as a Slovenian, we didn't have a university in Slovenia until after World War I. There was no medical school in Slovenia. The only thing, the highest school we had ever were the 2 dioceses having their theological seminaries. That's the only schools of upper education. You had to go to Vienna, you had to go to Munich, you had to go to Rome, you had to go somewhere else. And then when you came back, our language was suppressed. The critical thing, if you're a Slovenian, you take a look at Dušna Pasha, we didn't have prayer materials in Slovenian, right? And so this is the point where Baraga touched these peasants and they gave them an opportunity to pray with their heart. That's what he gave them. I think that it was so adamant about Baraga and then Pearce. It was, if a person wanted to work in the Indian missions, he had to come here to learn the language. You're not going to sit there and work with these people and preach to them in French or in English. You need to preach to them in Ottawa and Ojibwe. And so he understood this better than anything else. And I think, to me personally, I think these men empathized. They understood that in essence, and you take a look at the great gifts that Baraga gave, the dictionaries, the grammars, the prayer books. I mean, what he did is he went out of the way to make sure that people pray to God in the language that they're most comfortable with. And I think that's the message that has to go out. It's much different than perhaps other type of missionary activity had, but in their hearts, they knew what it meant to grow up in an oppressive society. I don't know, Curtis?
I'll keep this as short as I can, but this is a huge subject. There's a huge rebirth over the last few years in native spirituality. And unfortunately, that doesn't always translate well with any established religion, not only Catholicism. But one of the things that Baraga was so good at was that not only did he share his religion with the people here, he shared his heart with his people here. So I believe if we can get back to that, then it's not that big a step. There's at one time, Baraga had 100% of the Garden Islands was Catholic. That's a pretty high mark, but I would love to get back there. So I believe that if we do that, and there's so many things that between native spirituality and Catholicism that are so close. The 7 grandfather teachings and the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. We are almost lockstep. And if we can build on that, and again, we need to share from the heart, not just the mind.
Are there any other questions?
Right there.
Okay.
To the left. Oh, I'd be happy to painting. Oh, this painting.
Oh, she wants to know about it?
She wants to know where it's going to go.
Okay, I understand, maybe Father James can answer this better than mine, but it's going to be here in this hall. Okay.
We're in the whole process right now, we're looking at some of our rooms and how we want to rename them, so that we are once and culturating, kind of an osmosis moment that when you walk into this building, which used to be the old school, the old boarding school, and where the sisters of Notre Dame were at, we'll be having various names after sisters, Native American Indians, and some of the Wow, you can't hear me. Now you can hear me. Everybody's going to hear me. So as I was saying, the picture will be by the donation box is where this picture will be at. And as I said, we're in the process right now of kind of looking at the various rooms here throughout the building. This is where the original school, boarding school, was. Again, 3 stories high, a basement as well. And there are people in this room who went to the school here at our boarding school with the Sisters of Notre Dame, with the Franciscans as well. So we're going to be trying to put in various missionary individuals that were here, also Native Americans, as well as the Sisters and Franciscans. So to go through our building, at least in what I'm looking at is how it might be like an osmosis moment that we're kind of just knowing the names, and there'll be various history for these rooms as well. We will come to know our history. I've at least since I've been here, I've kind of come to the conclusion many people do not know the history of our parish, our school, and even this area. And I'm one of them, and I was just born down the road, Boyne Falls, population 384. Again, I was very ignorant of the area here as well. So I don't want to take any more time.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much, Father. Any other questions? Yes, Lenora. Yes, I was going to do that. Just go ahead. Well,
Nobody ever tells me that. And nobody ever gives me a microphone. First of all, thank you all for being here. Bishop Walsh, thank you. Brand new bishop, and we hit him right out of the gate asking if he'll be interested in hosting our Baraga Days event. Joe, Jane, thank you. He's going to be a saint in the eyes of the church because we know he's a saint. But now it's our job to pray for that. So we need to continue to teach and bring other people to know about Bishop Baraga, to bring them to the faith, and to pray for his cause for canonization. He's halfway there. We have a potential cure. We are waiting for it to be reviewed. When it is reviewed and when it is approved by the medical commission, that gets us to the status of blessed or beatification. We will have a huge party in Marquette. All are welcome.
Absolutely.
Then we need a second miracle after the beatification to get him canonized. But we'll take it one step at a time. What can we do? We can pray. There are prayer cards in the back. You can pray that prayer multiple times a day. You can go to our website. We've set up a tracker because it's a way for when they do review the case and they contact us and say, is there anybody other than the one crazy lady in Marquette that's really on fire for him? Are there other people supporting this? We can say, yes, look at all these people praying for his cause. There's novenas, the power of prayer. It gives me goosebumps because I sit in a special seat. I get the phone calls from the people who have started novenas for some really hopeless situations that have come out on the other side with the only answer being an answered prayer. So the power of prayer, those novenas, help yourself. The Baraga Bulletin is back there. It's got a schedule of the events because Baraga Days will be in the Diocese of Gaylord September 14th. There will be things happening here in this area, and we have it all laid out for you. So thank you again for coming to find out about this saintly man. And please continue to teach others. If you want to learn more, we've got all kinds of resources. Feel free to stop by, or we've got a website.
Thank you, Lenora. I can't wait for Baraga Days. Actually, it's the 13th is Vespers over at the diocese, and then Saturday is events at the diocese and over here along the coastline at St. Francis Lanus, Holy Childhood, St. Ignatius, and La Arbor-Croce History Museum, and Holy Cross Church. So they'll be open during the day some for anybody that wants to come. One last thing, unless there's another question. Is there anybody? Okay, I'd like to thank David Schimmel here. He is our computer expert, I'll call him, guru. He's the one that set all this up for us and all this nice electronic and the mics and everything. And he works for Holy Cross, Holy Childhood and Holy Cross. I would now like to ask Bishop Walsh to lead us in a closing prayer. Please stand.
You know, good bookends for prayer. Father Piers started our gathering with a song of the Our Father, lifting our voices to the Father. The church has always taught us at the end, as we kind of wind down prayer or wind down our reflections on God, to turn to our Blessed Mother. A lot of church documents end with references to our Blessed Mother, asking for her intercession. So it's a beautiful way that we can end our gathering tonight, chanting the beautiful prayer of the Hail Mary. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of death. Amen. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Let us go in peace.
Thanks be to God.